And right now here on WHAS 11 Plus, the trial of the decade in Kentucky appears now to be heading to the jury next Tuesday. We've got new details on that ahead. Hello, everybody, on this Wednesday night, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm Doug Prophet, WHAS 11 News. Well, in Bowling Green, Kentucky today, family members we've not heard a lot about, front and center, testifying for murder suspect Brooks Houck in the Crystal Rogers trial. The defense trying to prove that Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson, who's also on trial in that courtroom with him, had nothing to do with the murder of Crystal Rogers, as tomorrow, July 3rd, marks 10 years to the date of her disappearance. We want to begin now with WHAS 11 Shay McAllister in Bowling Green right now. And Shay, Houck's sister, a woman named Rhonda McElvoy, takes the stand and describes what her family was facing in the immediate aftermath of Crystal's disappearance on July 3rd, 10 years ago.
Absolutely, Doug. She set a scene that she described as full of threats and accusations. Brian Butler, Brooks' attorney, said, "When did fingers start pointing at you guys?" And she said, "Right away." She said she was feeling directly threatened. She felt like people were following her. She said she had to move her children to different schools. And eventually, later that year in 2015, her and her husband decided to move their children to an entire different state altogether just to get away with it. Get away from it, excuse me. That's exactly how they were feeling. He was also asked to describe the farm in 2015, the Houck family farm. And this was interesting because we've seen tons of video of it, drone video, helicopter video, but it's hard to tell exactly what was there and when. What she said today was that, number one, there was no hog farm in 2015. There was little pink pigs that have black dots on them, and they showed a picture of the pigs. Now, when she said little pink pigs, I was imagining little, like the size of this. They were larger than that. They were more like 40, 50-pound pigs when they showed the picture. She also described the structures that were on the farm at this time. She said there was a white house that her mother lived in. There was a large metal building that was used for storage. Brooks Houck would keep flooring or bathtubs in there to be used on the houses that he worked on. And then there was a small wooden shack or barn that was near the house. And she eventually moves back. A couple of years later, her dad, Brooks' dad, is diagnosed with cancer. He does not have a good prognosis, and she said that brought her home back to Nelson County in 2017. At that time, she moved into her mother's house, Rosemary Houck's house, and built a house right across the street there on Pascal Ballard Lane, that same road where the Houck family farm is. She moved in 2020. And Doug, they've been living there since then. A
point brought up today in the courtroom were those recordings made by the Houck family during the grand jury. What was Houck's sister's excuse for doing that? The prosecution has been saying it was a tactic to cover up for Brooks.
Right, the prosecution has said from the get-go, from Brooks' arrest, that this was all a family ploy together to get on the same page, to cover up a lie. And there was a very specific question today. The defense attorney actually asked, why did you decide to do this? What made you want to do this? And she said that she was paranoid. She said that she felt like her words were being twisted and used against her, that she and her family were being targeted. And so she wanted to know every single word that she did and didn't say. She wanted to have proof of those conversations that she would be able to use down the line if needed. There were some interesting questions from the prosecution here, because he was saying, well, did you guys have a meeting about this? Meaning the Houck family. Did you meet about the recordings? And she said there was no meeting. It was all due to the environment and circumstances. I felt the need to know what I did and did not say. And he said, well, your recorder was found along with 2 other recorders in that house. Did you know your other family members were also using recorders? She claims that she did not know that. She said that she found out that the other Houck family members were using recorders when she saw it on the news. And of course, Doug, the first time we found out about these secret grand jury proceedings was in 2023. So she's claiming today on the stand that she went 8 years without knowing that the other members of her family also recorded the grand jury proceeding. Another good question from the prosecution here. She claimed she wanted to record it so that she would know what she did and didn't say, but on one of those recordings, you can hear her going back and forth with her brother, Brooks, saying that she doesn't want to take it into the room. She doesn't want to do that. And he says, you have to take the recorder into the room. Jim Lasowski, the prosecution, says, don't you remember that? And she said, no, I don't remember. And he said, you don't remember him saying, take it in there because Nick wants to hear your testimony? And she was like, no, I don't remember that. So he pulls the transcript out, lets her read it for herself, and then says, does that refresh your memory? Do you remember now that you told your brother you didn't want to take the recorder in? And she said, well, I guess I just have a different interpretation of it. She would not give him that. She would not say that that was how it happened, Doug. So that was very interesting, those different storylines there.
Well, it was a classic trap question backed up by the evidence that he certainly knew he was going to be able to spring on her. And then you're right, her answer just sort of leaves everybody hanging there wondering what really happened there. Well, you know, Shay, finally the defense broke down those tinted car windows. We've heard so much about the windows there in the car. Brooks, Houck, the prosecution arguing that that move was made to hide who was sitting in the car or possibly in the car. But today, Brooks' sister helped his own case that it was for his son. Why is that?
So she told us a little bit more about Eli's eye condition. She said that Eli was born with an undeveloped optic nerve. That's what the eye condition was, and it makes him sensitive to light. She said while she's been taking care of him for the last 2 years, he's been to the doctor 5 times for issues with his eye. It's been a consistent concern. They also provided a medical record from October of 2015 citing something about the eye. They didn't show the medical record, just showed her to confirm that it existed. And interesting here, they talked about that window tinting extensively. First of all, one of the jurors wanted to know, were her windows tinted? Were Rhonda's windows tinted? Rhonda said yes. And then the juror wanted to know, were Crystal's windows tinted? And Rhonda said yes. I do want to say, I talked to the family about this a little bit later, and they told me there was a little bit of discrepancy there. Crystal didn't get the windows tinted. The windows had a tint when she bought the car.
All right, Shay, thank you so much. We're going to join Shay again with more about today's testimony. As tomorrow will, of course, take us right to the day before the holiday. WHS 11 News legal analyst is Louisville defense attorney Nick Mudd. He's also a former prosecutor who worked in the violent crimes unit in Louisville, so he looks at things both sides here. The importance of having Brooks' sister on there, a woman we'd really not heard a lot about. She comes out of the blue here today and is asked about the recording devices, is asked about were there hogs on the farm. I want to point out that it was 2 days ago on this streaming cast, you raised the question, why weren't they asking in the courtroom, were there hogs on the farm, period? The obvious question. Why did it come out today from Brian Butler?
Right, and I thought that day that was the obvious question. You and I talked about it. I mean, that would be the question that anybody would ask when that's, you know, being claimed a potential way that Crystal would have been unfortunately disposed of her body. You know, I think the defense put her up there for a couple reasons. The number one reason was to humanize Brooks Houck. You know, go for an emotional angle to say, hey, he's a human being too. You know, and I think that's a tactic a lot of times used by defense lawyers, putting up a family member to avoid also having to humanize themselves by testifying. Number two, I think it was to put up about the pig thing, to say, look, there were pigs on the farm. They weren't hogs, but they were small little pigs, and I think she even entered a photo of that. You know, I do think the prosecution did some damage with her, though. Looked a little, I don't want to say shady, but certainly odd that she would bring a recorder in, and then we heard of the conversation with Brooks Houck and his sister that Jim Lasowski impeached her with. And an impeachment basically is saying, you're saying one thing, but I have a statement that shows you said something else, okay?
Well, Brian Butler asked her again directly about why were you wearing a recording device? Why were you secretly recording that grand jury testimony? And she said, quote, this comes from our WHS 11 blog, which is reporting the information right out of the courtroom from Shay and Alexandra Goldberg. Quote, I was paranoid. The whole family was paranoid due to the threats and accusations. Her answers just sort of went nowhere. And again, we're talking about Rhonda McAvoy, this woman right here, right front and center of your screen. That was Brooks' sister. her answer sort of went nowhere. Do you think she has much credibility with the jury? I mean, how do you rank her performance today on the stand and what it does for Brooks Houck?
I don't think she added much, but I don't think she took much away. Kind of broke even. But I will say, Doug, the quote you just read is going to be the theme for Brooks Houck's attorneys in closing. I don't know if it's going to be Brian Butler or Steve Shoring, but they are going to hit on that. Why did you do X, Y, and Z? We were scared. We felt targeted. Why did you bring a recording into grand jury? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? We were targeted. We were targeted. And we even heard Brian Butler really say that theme yesterday in what's the directed verdict, where the judge, they basically asked the judge to get rid of the case from the defense side because there's not enough evidence, which obviously we know the judge overruled. But he said, you know, it wasn't for lack of trying. He said, certainly, we know they turned over every stone, but he's not guilty, but it's not for lack of trying. And I think that's going to be, if Butler closes or Shoring closes, one or the other, that's going to be their theme for closing. And I think that quote that she said is going to be that same thing. Look, I've been targeted from the beginning, and they found nothing on me.
I've been wanting to pick your brain about this because I see sort of a fascinating trend in this trial. The jury asked the sister if Crystal Rogers' windows were tinted. She responded, yes, very dark windows. A juror wanted to know if McElvoy was in any of the photos taken in Louisville on the 3rd of July when she said she was there, visiting there on the day that Crystal Rogers disappeared. And then a juror had a great question for her, asking if she stayed the night in Louisville, and if not, what time did she leave? She said no, they did go home that night on the 3rd of July, but couldn't specify that time. Again, the 3rd of July, the last day Crystal Rogers was seen alive. What about these jurors asking these questions? Is this unusual? And what is it telling you about the jury that's going to get this case possibly next Tuesday, according to the judge?
Well, I'm going to start backwards here. I think, Doug, that maybe they're trying to see, was she involved? Because they're finally getting to hear from a family member from the Houck family. Remember, Brooks Houck, I don't think will testify. Has a right to, has a right not to. Probably won't. My prediction there. Number 2, Rosemary Houck. Hasn't testified, probably won't. Nick Houck hasn't testified, probably won't. We've heard about all these people, so I think the jurors finally have someone in the family, and so they're picking apart, was she involved too? And I think some of those questions lend that way. Now, that being said, going back to, is it common for jurors to ask questions? Mm-hmm. A lot of judges don't allow it, and I'm talking from state court, district, circuit, where we're talking misdemeanors, felony, traffic offenses, all the way through serious charges in federal court, drug charges, extortion charges, things like that. A lot of times the judges do not allow that at all. They just think it's inappropriate, but some judges do, and I've had it happen in multiple trials where a judge gives the jury the option. They get one chance, they write them down, the attorneys discuss the questions, and then if it's appropriate, the judge lets them ask.
All right, I want to have you analyze some more information from our courtroom. Again, our reporters who are covering all the details right now in Bowling Green. We want to go back to Bowling Green with Shay McAllister. And Shay, we haven't heard much about Joseph Lawson. He's sitting right there in the courtroom during this trial, or heard even a lot from his attorney, something they pointed out when they made opening statements today.
So they reserve the right to do those opening statements after the prosecution, and basically, Doug, you could tell why, because they geared their opening statements to every single thing that the prosecution had mentioned about him, which, like you said, was very little. What Kelvin Coleman, his attorney, said today was that Joey Lawson is collateral damage. As far as Joey Lawson's case goes, there's no forensic evidence that Joey Lawson was in that car. He alleges that Joey is collateral damage because of the prosecution's attempt to prosecute Brooks Houck, that they needed Joey and other people to be involved to make their case. He told the jurors, once you look at all of the evidence we have, you'll conclude what we already have, and that is that Joseph Lawson is not guilty. It was very short, like so much of Joseph's mention in this case, and then we were quickly moved right back on to Brooks Houck, his defense attorneys presenting their evidence, their witnesses, and one of the big ones today outside of Brooks' sister was a new expert on cell phone data. So I'm going to bring in Alexandra Goldberg. She was listening in to that expert today. So tell us about that expert, who he was, and what he was saying.
Well, Shay, remember, this case is all about circumstantial evidence, meaning the prosecution is going after things like cell phone data as some of their main pillars to prosecute here. Remember from last week, we had that LMPD digital forensic detective, Tim O'Daniel, who said, according to cell phone records, Stephen Lawson could be seen around the area of the Bluegrass Parkway near mile marker 14 where Crystal Rogers' car was during the late hours around midnight on July 3rd. He also said that according to Brooks Houck's cell phone data, he actually didn't go right home after visiting the Houck family farm. He says that he made a stop at the My Old Kentucky Home campground. Well, we had a witness testify today for the defense who says, no, that's not the case. His name is Adrian Lauf, and he's a computer engineering expert. He's also a longtime professor at U of L. Of course, the defense took a couple minutes here for him to sort of boast his educational career and his accolades here. But he reviewed records and reports related to the cell phone data in this case. He says, according to his professional interpretation of this cell phone data, Stephen Lawson was actually on Boston Road, which is a road parallel to the Bluegrass Parkway. He says that when he was receiving cell phone calls and data calls from cell phone tower, evidence shows that different directions of the cell phone data of the cell phone tower actually place him north of those cell phone towers, which would have been Boston Road. And this, of course, would confirm the defense's theory that Stephen Lawson that night on July 3rd was actually going to go retrieve a car that he shared with his ex-girlfriend, Heather Snellen, that was parked at Snellen's family's home on Boston Road. Now, Adrian also confirmed some things out of his own interpretation of this data about that tidbit that we learned about the My Old Kentucky Home campground. He says that, well, your phone is always looking for Wi-Fi. That means your phone is going to see Wi-Fi networks on the side of the road. And remember, according to that cell phone data, it shows Brooks Houck was at the campground at around 12:08 a.m. early morning of July 4th. He says you could only pick up on that Wi-Fi for even an instant, and it will still record that you were there. Now, of course, in the cross-examination here, Special Prosecutor Shane Young came hard at the accuracy of this data. He argued that the data was inaccurate. He argued that there were potentially some disclaimers about this data use and that there are larger margins of error and it's hard to be, conclusive in this analysis. He even found one inaccurate data point, and he asks the witness, does this cause you to call any of this data into question? And he says, I'm not calling anything into question. And why this is important is because this witness testified a couple years ago stating that if there was one inaccurate point of data, it would sort of muddle all of the other data points for him. But he's saying this is a different case. This is a different data set, and these were done in different years.
It's all very interesting. Also, I know people find this fascinating. So for this particular witness, he is going to be paid around $10,000 for his participation in the trial. So they do pay him to review the case and then to provide this testimony for Brooks Houck. Interesting to note here too, anyone who's been paying attention to these cases and anyone who was watching the Steve Lawson trial knows that Steve Lawson admitted to being on the Bluegrass Parkway. He told the jurors that he went to pick up his son, Joey Lawson, who had called him when the car broke down. He told the jurors that he physically moved up Crystal's seat in her car. He admitted to all of this, but this particular jury has not heard any of that. Shane Young has not mentioned any of Steve Lawson's testimony regarding this. He has not mentioned the guilty verdict, Doug. And so while we all have this background information, this current jury does not.
Well, Shay, of course, tomorrow it takes us to Thursday, the day right before the holiday. Do you think the judge holds a full day of court tomorrow, or what are you all both expecting to see play out?
He told us today, he met with the attorneys right before he let the jury go home, and he kind of gave us a layout for the rest of the week. He said tomorrow will be the rest of the witness testimony for the defense. He expects it to last all day, likely, I think he said until 4 o'clock, right, Central Time. We'll be off on Friday, of course, for the 4th of July. On Monday, they'll be presenting closing arguments. They'll be doing jury instructions, which can take several hours. It did in the Steve Lawson trial, just to agree on what those instructions will look like. And then they're sending the jurors home so they can be fresh on Tuesday morning to deliberate.
All right, Shay McAllister, Alexandra Goldberg. You can follow their work, by the way, from the courtroom as they are posting when they get a break. They're very detailed notes, no cameras allowed in the courtroom on WHAS11.com. Folks, it's right on our front page of our webpage there, along with WHAS 11 digital journalist Joseph Garcia. It's excellent. Thank you both. It's how I follow the details throughout the day, along with WHAS 11 News legal analyst Nick Mudd. Nick, so as we go into tomorrow, would you expect any major bombshell witnesses? You know, I was thinking about people we haven't heard. We haven't heard from the Bardstown Police Chief, Rick McCubbin, who fired Nick Houck. We haven't heard from Ed Mattingly, who's the sheriff there, who first said Brooks Houck is the chief suspect in this case, but could never make an arrest.
Well, Doug, the prosecution's case is over. They're done. They presented it. I highly doubt the defense would subpoena those witnesses and have them testify. They could, but it's highly doubtful. That being said, the prosecution, once the defense rests, gets one more go. They get to do what's called rebuttal. And what rebuttal does is where you're allowed to call a witness or witnesses or put on proof that rebut something that was said by a witness from the prosecution. That would be like another expert to rebut their cell phone expert, or someone to rebut the testimony from Brooks Houck's sister. I don't think right now we've seen much that would justify having a rebuttal by the prosecution, but certainly it's possible.
Okay, I've got a round of 6 questions for Nick Mudd. Many of these questions you've been asking, and it will also sort of bring you up to date as we stand the last day of the trial this week. Again, as you heard Shay just report, the judge is going to take it into the closing arguments on Monday, right after the 4th of July holiday, and then it'll get into the hands of the jury on Tuesday. Question number 1 for you. Let's talk about the witness of the day, the sister of Brooks Houck, Rhonda McElvoy. Why did the defense think it was a good idea to call her?
Again, I think just to humanize. I mean, that was the main reason why. And the pig thing was important. I think the tenant windows there.
Why was the pig question important to bring up? Because the jury had already heard that very gruesome testimony from, as reported, that
Right.
Joseph Lawson had reportedly said.
And I think that the witness that stated that Joseph Lawson or Stephen Lawson, who's made that statement, you know, really didn't have much credibility, but I think the defense was prepared just to combat that, to say, look, they couldn't have fed him to hogs could not have fed Crystal's body to hogs on the farm because there weren't any at the time. All we had was 5 little small pigs.
Tinted windows. The tinted
Right.
windows of the car, they've been talked about for a long time, but she gave that explanation that it was for the child's eyes.
Right, right. I wasn't focused on it at all, but then one juror asked, I think, 3 different questions. Your window's tinted, or your window, you know, they're asking lots of questions.
Here's the question, right?
You know, and I think that I assume that would, at least in that juror's mind, was important. I just haven't found that to be that compelling. I know the prosecution made the assumption that Brooks Houck got his windows tinted a few days before, but it's a reasonable explanation with the child's ailment at that time.
At 10:30 this morning, Joseph Lawson's attorney, now again, Joseph Lawson is on trial here, conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with physical evidence. He is in the courtroom there next to Brooks Houck. Joseph Lawson's attorney, Kevin Coleman, started today's hearing by saying Lawson is collateral damage. As far as Joey's case goes, there is no forensic evidence that he was in that car, alleging that Lawson is collateral in the Commonwealth's case here to prosecute Brooks Houck. So what is the case against Joseph Lawson here?
That's the question I keep asking myself, Doug.
Really?
You know, Stephen Lawson had admitted to essentially moving the car, tampering physical evidence. We heard that in the last trial. But, you know, nothing was with Joseph Lawson, and there has been no proof of an agreement with Brooks Houck by Joseph Lawson to move Crystal's body, to conspire in the murder of Crystal Rogers, or to tamper with any physical evidence.
Well, does the prosecutor have to prove that there was an agreement, though, to kill Crystal with either Brooks or Steve Lawson?
Well, with the conspiracy charge, they do have to prove some sort of an agreement in order to convict Joseph Lawson. Not with the tampering. The tampering, they just have to show that, you know, basically hid an item of it's called to impair the veracity of an item of evidence for later availability at trial, is the way it reads.
So Steve Lawson he did testify on that.
Right.
Why are people, if if Brooks Houck is the main murder suspect here, why aren't people just spilling the beans to try to cover themselves? We haven't seen that happen yet.
I've had a lot of people ask me, they're like, has the jury heard that Steve Lawson was convicted? Have the jury heard that Steve Lawson stated, you know, he tampered with evidence and he tampered with Crystal's car? The jury will not and cannot hear that evidence. It is inadmissible. And I'll tell you why, Doug. If that is brought out by the prosecution, it will end in an automatic mistrial. And if these individuals get convicted and it comes in, the appeals court would reverse the conviction. Now, the main reason is that the defense lawyers here are allowed to have a chance to question, what we call cross-examine, Stephen Lawson. Well, Stephen Lawson's not going to testify. He still has a Fifth Amendment right not to get on the stand, and I don't foresee him getting on the stand voluntarily.
You don't see him there?
Not at all.
Okay, so you just explained the rules about the prosecutor possibly mentioning it.
Right.
All right, why can't the prosecutor just call Lawson or Houck to the stand as witnesses? Just say, you're being called up.
So in a car wreck case, med mal case, what we call a civil case over money, you're allowed to call who the defendant is to the stand. You're allowed to do that. And I've had civil lawyers even tell me, hey, why don't they just call him to the stand? You can't do that in a criminal case. It is a constitutional right in the United States to what's called the right against self-incrimination. Doesn't matter if your Miranda rights are read, you cannot force someone as a prosecutor to get on the stand when they've been accused of a crime.
Let's talk about the two unindicted co-conspirators, not charged, and they are not on trial in this case. But we're talking about the mother of the boys, Rosemary Houck, and of course Nick Houck, the former Bardstown cop who was fired by Chief Rick McCubbin and is the brother of Brooks Houck. Can't the prosecutor just subpoena them and force them to testify? Bring them into the courtroom. They've been ever present in this trial, almost being mentioned more than Brooks himself.
And that would be a brilliant strategy. Unfortunately, that would cause a mistrial if they did so. Two things here, Doug. Number one, they were mentioned as co-conspirators by the prosecution. No one else, by the prosecution. What that means is right away, they have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Means the prosecutor cannot ethically call them to the stand knowing that they may be involved in a criminal conduct. Secondly, Doug, if a prosecutor knowingly calls a witness to the stand in front of the jury, knowing that witness will plead the Fifth, that's an automatic mistrial.
You're so close to the end of this. Nobody wants a mistrial.
Right. No, absolutely
so
not.
Pins and
that
needles.
would be a disaster. I mean, a complete disaster.
Why did the defense, specifically Joseph Lawson's lawyers, call their own cell phone expert to testify today, a person named Adrian Lauf?
And I think that person is apparently very well respected. I don't know Professor Lauf, but he teaches at U of L. I think he's a well-respected professor there, is my understanding. I think what they're trying to show, at least from Joseph Lawson's perspective, is, look, it was impossible for that phone to hit on the tower at Bluegrass Parkway. It would have hit on the, I think it was over Boston Road, which means that they're claiming Stephen Lawson had no involvement because his phone didn't hit over there. Remember, though, Doug.
What Shay just reported.
Remember, Doug. Remember. Here's the thing. Two things. Number one, the conviction against Stephen Lawson, the jury does not, cannot, will not hear.
And they don't know what
They don't know it. Number two, Stephen Lawson's statement cannot, will not, shall not be played in this case, and the jury will never hear about it because Stephen Lawson's not going to testify. He gets on the stand, play away, but he's not getting on the stand.
But okay. Well, wait a second. Time out. So the record puts him over on Boston Road.
According to the
But Lawson himself, as Shay just told us, he said himself he was there on the Bluegrass Parkway.
I don't make the rules, Doug.
So what?
I don't make the rules.
So does that make the case that the cell phone tower, the ping, was actually coming from somewhere else? So for any parent who's had that family mapping thing you can do for AT&T when your kids are young, you think they're one place, but they're actually, it's the same showing you another.
Possible. Certainly the expert that testified for Joseph Lawson today said, he was on Boston Road. There's no way he would have hit that tower over there on the Bluegrass Parkway.
Well, how come that didn't come out in his case? Well, we can't retry that.
Yeah,
that case is gone.
Because he said he was there moving the car is the problem.
But, you know, cell phones going to be very important in this case. Again, this is a case of circumstantial evidence. There is no body, there is no weapon, there is no crime scene. And so far, the most compelling evidence has been the scientific evidence related to the cell phones, which I guess this can be the most reliable. And as you pointed out, that's going to be the compelling storyline toward the end here, because that cell phone evidence does take Brooks Houck and Crystal Rogers together on the 3rd of July. Again, 10 years tomorrow, 10 years ago, the 3rd of July, with that expert who was on there showing that she was on her cell phone from like 7:30 to 9:30 playing games.
Right. Not only together, but we're not talking 8 or 9 in the morning on July 3rd. We're talking the night of July 3rd, the night that she is never seen ever again. And so I think that is the most compelling evidence. The most compelling argument the prosecution have is, look, she was playing games till 9:30. Everybody has testified she had a date with Brooks Houck. Everybody knows she went to meet Brooks Houck, and then she's never seen from again. But can they prove it is the question.
All right, we pick up that storyline tomorrow. You know, it was not a day of bombshell witnesses. There's only been a few of those coming out this whole trial, but it was a day of a lot of interesting information, I thought, that came out.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's, you know, certainly we finally heard from Joey Lawson's attorney, though, right? We never heard an opening statement from them. And I think we finally heard from someone from the Houck family. We've not heard from anyone from the Houck family. We didn't expect to hear from anyone from the Houck family at all.
I didn't know much about his sister. There she was today, Rhonda McElvoy. Thank you very much for watching us here on WHS 11+. That trial resumes again tomorrow in Bowling Green on Thursday before it takes a break for the long holiday weekend. We, of course, will have coverage for you on all of our Channel 11 WHS TV newscasts at noon, 4, 5, 6, and 11 o'clock. And then we'll all be back here with you again tomorrow night for another 30-minute edition at 9 p.m. on the free WHS 11+ app. The Crystal Rogers trial. It is the trial of the decade underway in Kentucky, and it is moving toward a close by next Tuesday, possibly on WHAS 11+. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.